Mrs. and Mr. Steptoe, from Los Angeles, live in Claines Hall, near Lewes Chippings, Sussex. Over the fireplace hangs a portrait by artist Jocelyn Jos Weatherby of Mrs. Beatrice Chavender, widow of Mrs. Steptoe's brother. With a haughty expression, the rich, socially ambitious Mrs. Steptoe, who gives her poor relation Sally tasks to earn her keep, tells Sally to go to London to find a valet who can make her reluctant husband dress respectably for high society. Mrs. Chavender finds the breakfast hum uneatable, since it is a Paramount hum, a product sold by Duff and Trotter. She decides to complain to her former fiancé James Duff, managing director of the firm, because he used to bore her about hum. George, 2nd Baron Holbeton, worries this will upset Duff. Duff is the trustee of his inheritance, since George's father was Duff's business partner, and George wants the money. George's fiancée Sally volunteers to talk to Duff. Jos Weatherby, advertising artist for Duff and Trotter, sees Mrs. Chavender at Duff's office. Duff has stepped out to avoid her. Mrs. Chavender thinks Duff has become a grouch because he is not married and asks if Jos is married. Jos has not married but is eager to marry someday, and tells Mrs. Chavender that she will see quick service as soon as the right girl comes along. Later, Duff thinks of using Jos' portrait of Mrs. Chavender for a Paramount hum advertising poster, with her looking at a non-Paramount hum with haughty disapproval. But Mrs. Steptoe refuses to sell the painting for fear of offending Mrs. Chavender, since she might someday inherit Mrs. Chavender's wealth. Duff fires Jos for eating company fruit. Sally appears, and Jos quickly falls in love with her. She needs a valet, and Jos takes the job to be near her. Duff makes a deal with Sally that George can get his money if he steals the portrait, claiming he wants the painting because he still loves Mrs. Chavender. At Claines Hall, Jos befriends the butler Chibnall and blackmails Mr. Steptoe, who tried to win money off the cook in a game of craps, into dressing correctly for high society. He gives Mr. Steptoe advice on playing craps, and Steptoe confides in Jos that he wants to be an actor in Hollywood but lacks money for transportation. Duff doubts George will steal the painting and offers to buy it from Mr. Steptoe, who recruits Jos to steal it. George tries to steal it but fails. Jos also makes a failed attempt, and Chibnall, influenced by his fiancée Vera who reads crime novels, is now suspicious of Jos. Mrs. Chavender tells Jos she wants a share of Duff's payment for the painting, since she actually lost her money in a stock crash. She has kept this secret from Mrs. Steptoe, who is not generous with her poor relations. She also informs Jos about Sally's engagement to George. Duff tells Sally about Jos' feelings for her. Both Jos and Sally hope to steal the painting during Mrs. Steptoe's garden party, but the party is ruined by rain. Mr. Steptoe has lost badly at craps and needs money, so Jos takes a chance and steals the painting. He also tells Sally he wants to marry her and impulsively kisses her. George sees this and ends their engagement, since he no longer wants to marry her anyway. Jos apologizes, but Sally reveals she wants to marry Jos. Mrs. Steptoe finds Jos smoking in her room and fires him. Duff changes his mind about George and gives him his money, and inadvertently proposes to Mrs. Chavender, who accepts, having heard he still loves her. Jos and Duff plan to retrieve the painting from Jos' room. Vera eavesdrops and warns Chibnall. Chibnall finds the painting, apprehends Jos and Duff, and brings Jos to Mrs. Steptoe. Jos tries to take the blame for stealing the painting, and so does Mrs. Chavender, who admits she needs the money. Mr. Steptoe, impressed with Jos for not revealing his involvement, becomes more assertive and defends Jos. He declares he will sell Duff the painting and convinces Mrs. Steptoe to come with him to Hollywood. where there is less rain. At Mrs. Chavander's insistence, Duff rehires and promotes Joss, and bribes Chibnall to keep quiet about Duff's misadventures, allowing Chibnall and Vera to buy a pub. Duff is uncertain about marrying Mrs. Chavender, until he realizes they are soulmates when she suggests using her portrait in a Hum advertisement.